Welcome everybody. My name's Helen Morgan and I'm representing the Australian Women's Archives Project who are co-hosting this event with Public Record Office Victoria today. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, the land of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Normally, Nikki Henningham is here and I'm standing in for her today because she's off in New Zealand. And we give a report on the work of the Australian Women's Register over the last 12 months. We've got two terrific speakers today, so I'm not going to give a long report. Instead, what I'm going to encourage you to do is, hopefully you are all familiar with the Australian Women's Register, which is the main publication of the Australian Women's Archives Project. In November last year, we started a newsletter. We only send out 4 a year, so it's not onerous in terms of, lots of emails and spam. If you're not signed up, and I did take the liberty of signing people up without asking them last year, you can go to the Australian Women's Register, hit subscribe, and just fill out this form and you'll be on our list and you can unsubscribe at any time. And with each newsletter that I send out, I have a link to the previous newsletters so you can catch up with our news. I will, though, show just a sneak peek here. Another thing you can go away and look at. This is a new exhibition that we published last week on International Women's Day, Redefining Leadership, which is about 7 fabulous women leaders up in Canberra who are in the disability space, and there are really some terrific stories there, so I would encourage you to have a look at that. Another housekeeping notice is that we're being recorded, and this hasn't been tried before, which is why I'm speaking very precisely. So the whole session will be recorded, any of your questions will be recorded. Bear that in mind, and because we need to be heard, we hopefully will repeat the questions back so that the audience on YouTube can hear us. Not live, mind you. The other thing I'd just like to point out, it is, we said this was belated International Women's Day event. Many of you will know that the whole of March used to be Women's History Month, and it seems to have, I don't know why it isn't Women's History Month anymore. There are many things going on in March anyway, and the Royal Historical Society of Victoria have a lecture next Tuesday the 19th, Marilyn Lake, and it's their inaugural Women's History lecture, and they're very keen to get March back as the Women's History Month. So let's consider this as a bit of a nod towards that. So anybody who's a member, this is open to members and non-members. There's a fee if you're a non-member, but that looks like it's going to be a terrific talk and event next Tuesday at the RHSV. All right. Those of you who attended this last year will know that we had Amber Evangelista, who previously worked at Prov and is now at the Victoria Police Museum, talking about women in policing. And the very exciting thing that happened last week was that one of the women that we discussed here last year, Madge Connor, a pioneer of women's rights in Victoria Police and across the state, was posthumously inducted to the 2019 Victoria Honour Roll of Women. So that is terrific. It just goes to show that even though mostly people on that list are living, if you think someone in the past has been overlooked, you can nominate them, and we encourage you to do so. So our first speaker today is Dr. Deb Towns, followed by Dr. Liz Rushen. I will introduce you. I think a lot of people will know you, Deb, but let's hear about you. You're a sociologist and a historian. You're currently employed at the Centre for Workplace Leadership, Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne as a research associate. And last year, your wonderful book, Secondary Education for All, A History of State Secondary Schooling in Victoria, which you co-authored with Dr. John Andrews, won the Collaborative Community History Award at the 2018 Victorian Community History Awards. So congratulations on that. That was a really fantastic outcome there. You've written many publications in gender and education, gender in workplaces and women's history, including essays for our own Encyclopedia of Women and Leadership in 20th Century Australia. And your volunteer work includes President, League of Women Voters Victoria, and Employment and Economics Advisor for the National Council of Women Victoria. So please welcome Dr. Deb Towns.
All right, well, thank you for a wonderful introduction and welcome everybody. So I was invited to give a talk, and I thought I'd like to talk about one of the women who I spent a lot of time researching in the Public Record Office. And I was thrilled to see that the advertisement, that I don't know who did it, but they found another article which I hadn't found about, May Cox. And this was in the Sporting Globe. Now, May Cox was somebody who I discovered by reading Vision and Realisation. I don't know if anybody knows that book, but it's about 2,000 pages and 3 volumes. And I wanted to write about women who were leaders in the education department. So my idea was women who were influential, because probably for nearly the whole of the 20th century, women weren't allowed to be formal leaders in the education department. So I went through Vision and Realisation, and May Cox had 2 photographs in there. Nearly all the other photographs were of men. Now, I'm just having a bit of trouble finding the... Do I have to press to go on to the next one? Sorry. Oh.
That's all right. So, it's okay. Click that one.
All right. So, May Cox was born in South Melbourne and died in Sydney, and thereby there's a tale there as to why she's always been a sort of an emotional person in my life, with my research and also having been a teacher in the education department. So when I started to research her and realising she must have been someone considered important to have been in the Education Gazette and Teacher's Aid, I realised that firstly I'd have to look in the teaching service records, which are gold mines for those who want to research about early women's lives in Victoria who were teachers. So she started as a pupil teacher, but she was quickly sent to Albert Park State School, which was a famous school in its day because it had many swimming champions. In particular, he became Sir Frank Beaurepaire and his sister Lily, who were Olympians. Now, I have a photo here of, not too good with this. Oh, next, here you go, sorry, it's a bit different. So this here is an early photo of May Cox, and what you're going to find in any photos of her is she loved dressing up. She was an absolute character. Now, this photo is from 1905, and if you have a look, it's very Edwardian. These are the girls who were in the winning swimming team, and this school was the state champion school for about 10 years. And this is when she first met Frank Tate, who was the Director of Education for nearly 30 years. Quite a powerhouse, because the education department was, or the secondary part in particular, was really formed by him and really didn't change for nearly 80 years until the 1980s. So that's when she first met him. So 1905, that's a photograph of her there, and Lily Beaurepaire is the one sitting on her left. So there's also a photo in the series of Frank Beaurepaire, and it's interesting because the girls were all dressed up like that and the boys had their bathers on. So what happened was, in 1910, the education department and other departments around Victoria, Australia, had to establish swimming, especially for boys, because from 1911 it was compulsory for boys to do physical education and swimming because they were going to be, or they were cadets, and of course they were seen as potential soldiers for the army. I suppose people didn't know that the First World War was going to start in 1914. So she was taken out of Albert Park State School and she went to the head office of 2 Treasury Place, and she became the supervisor of swimming and lifesaving, a position she held from 1910 to 1938. She was the only person actually who held the position as one person in the position. In all other states it was combined with physical education. She was very creative about her career too. She was constantly writing letters. That's what I wanted to refer to here. I can't, again, have a go here. Sorry. Right, now, her personality. If you have a look at her, very, very flamboyant person. The more I looked at newspapers, the public service records, education department gazettes and teacher's aid, she was writing all the time, talking all the time about how important she was. She said her work was of national significance, teaching people to swim. She actually taught boys and girls, and she also had male staff, which was very unusual. She also worked with another person who has had a bit of fame throughout Australia, Rosalie Virtue. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she was also a leading physical education teacher, recognised even internationally. So she and May Cox had both very influential positions in Victoria, because the boys didn't learn physical education. They learnt swimming, but they were doing cadets, so they learnt how to handle a rifle and things like that. So the girls did learn physical education because the idea was that they should be strong, motherly types. Anyway, what happened was in 1910 she started. She pioneered swimming for students and teachers all around Victoria. If you were a teacher, you could get a certificate in swimming. So earlier it was a letter there that she's writing to have her pay put up, and that's Frank Tate's signature. I noticed they both have flamboyant signatures. And for nearly 10 years, she tried to get her salary raised. She had a very low salary. It was not much different to being a classroom teacher. Now, from 1911, Frank Beaurepaire joined her. Now, he'd been a pupil at the school when she was teaching, but since then he'd represented Australia in the Olympic Games. He didn't win a gold medal, but he was a world champion swimmer. He started to work with her, and he immediately earned probably nearly £50 a year more than her, and yet she'd pioneered the work. They both taught boys and girls and men and women, which was quite unusual. She argued as to why she should earn more money, because she actually supported her sister, her mother, and her niece and nephew. But it was a long time before she got a bigger salary. So I found out also that she'd had another role. From 1914 to 1919, she was Executive Secretary to the Education Department's State Schools Patriotic League. It was a huge job. I've read all the minutes. I had another read through some of them this morning. It was a huge job. Everybody had these wonderful ideas of what could be done to raise money, and the Education Department actually raised more money than any other government department in Victoria and had hundreds of pounds left over. And you've probably heard of Villers-Bretonneux, the school. Well, again, because Victoria raised so much money through an incredible organisation of May Cox, because she had a huge network in every school in Victoria. She was able to coordinate, and it was almost compulsory for teachers to spend every day thinking of ways of raising money for the war effort. Frank Tate actually complimented her and said in the Education Department's Record of War Service, and both these materials are in the Public Record Office, that she could be commended for doing more than anybody else in the Education Department for raising money. Anyway, he was invited by the French government to go over to France, and they rebuilt Villers-Bretonneux School, and I don't know if anybody's visited it, but it mentions the importance of Australian or Victorian children, and he got the Legion of Honour, but no mention of any awards for May Cox, even though he publicly, and was in the Age, the Argus, and as I said, in the Education Department's Record of War Service. You can see that she, again, was an influential person. This is at the Natty Muck Swimming Centre. This is during the war, 1916. It's a huge poster, which I found in a book. She was called the Chief Lady Swimming Expert in Victoria. And there are many, many little posters similarly addressed to her as being the person, the draw card. Look at her name there. She was not only an expert on swimming and lifesaving, and I forgot to mention that she and Frank Beaurepaire were the first people in Victoria to get a bronze medallion for swimming and lifesaving. They actually taught each other and passed each other to get the first bronze medallion. But anyway, she, again, this flamboyant personality, which, as I said, you pick up in newspapers, and you'll see more photos in a minute. So anyway, she was such a draw card. Now, during this time, Frank Beaurepaire was actually overseas fighting in the First World War as a soldier, so she was now on her own, and she would be on her own from now on until 1938, doing teaching. He came back, and he was a very famous character, a hard-working, enterprising character. He set up Beaurepaire Tyre Company. He became Mayor of Melbourne. He became a Member of Parliament. He was very influential. He had a lot to do with the Olympic Games coming to Melbourne in 1956, but unfortunately he died a few months beforehand. By that time, May Cox wasn't in Victoria anymore, but I just thought I'd put this book here. It has the most gorgeous cover. It's in the State Library. I'm not aware of one being here. But they wrote it together about swimming. And again, I'm emphasising that she was just seen as this incredible personality. Now, this one's a bit odd, this photo, because she retired in 1938, and a friend of mine had this photo. He knows, how do you point? I don't know. This woman here, sitting on her left, she became the vice principal of Bendigo Teachers College. Her name was Miss Burnett. Those three were very good friends. As you can see, this May Cox in the middle there, she looks very unusual. She was often like that. She was just an interesting personality. But just to go back a bit, in between that time when I talked about her first teaching swimming and lifesaving, it ended up being thousands and thousands of students. That original article right at the beginning there from the Sporting Globe, it actually mentions her annual report where she reports on teaching, 10,000, 15,000 students to swim. So by the end of her career, she could climb probably hundreds of thousands, and she did. She was actually invited by the Manly mayor to go up to Sydney and demonstrate how she taught swimming in Manly. She was the guest of honour of the mayor of Manly. This is before she retired. She was just constantly in the newspaper. She was constantly writing articles. She also went to different coastal towns around Victoria, and Queenscliff in particular and Geelong were two areas where she taught swimming. And my grandmother learnt to swim down in Geelong, and I just wonder, it would have been around the same time that she was teaching swimming. I just wonder whether my grandmother was taught to swim by May Cox. Anyway, the interesting thing is she married in 1938. She was 55 then, but the story was that she and some other women, I've been reliably informed, did live with fellows, but they wanted to keep their careers, they wanted to keep their salaries, and they wanted their superannuation. She married within days of retiring and became May Lloyd, and that's when I had a lot of problems because I couldn't find out when she'd passed away and anything else about her after 1938. So it was a while before I found out her name had changed to May Lloyd, and the reason is because Rosalie Virtue, who I mentioned earlier, she retired about 5 years later, and it said there that May Lloyd, previously May Cox, had come down from Sydney to her retirement party. And I thought, so I started to look around a bit more, and I thought, what does that mean? Am I going to find out about when she possibly died? I mean, of course I was going to be sad, but she must have died because she was born in the 1890s. But what happened was I was searching, and I put that photo because I love her in that photo. this is so typical of her. So here she is dressed up. This is in Queenscliff. Every year they had a special swimming 2 weeks for teachers. Teachers volunteered 2 weeks of their holidays to learn to swim. They went to Queenscliff. Some came from interstate, and they had a dress-up party as part of the proceedings. And she was actually called the Queen of Hearts, which I think is very interesting because, as you know, the Princess of Wales was actually called the Queen of Hearts many years later, but May Cox was referred to as the Queen of Hearts. So she just loved dressing up. I mean, that's incredible. That would be from the 1930s. That's in the Vision and Realisation. So anyway, because of finding out about her surname, I didn't initially realise, and I shouldn't have mentioned that I knew she came from Sydney because that wasn't mentioned. I didn't know she came from Sydney, so for the retirement party. So I'm looking in Victoria for a death notice or the wills here. No, didn't help. And it was sort of like the last chapter of my PhD from a few years ago, and there was still a blank space. And I just wanted to know what had happened to her because she'd been such an influential person in the Victorian community. And so eventually I searched Trove. So that would have been about 2009 I was searching Trove, and I found the death notice in there for May Lloyd. And of course I was immediately sad, and it mentioned in there that she'd been a swimming teacher from Victoria, so I knew it was her. Anyway, then I thought, well, I'd come here again to the PROV because of the probate issue, because remember earlier I said she supported her niece and nephew and her sister and so on, and I thought, well, maybe even though the will is in Sydney, because I didn't know enough about it back then, maybe the probate somehow would mention her niece and nephew. So my ignorance is showing, but I know a bit more about it now. So anyway, I came here and there was the probate and there was the will, and I never forget sitting out there and just bursting into tears, and people came up to me and they thought it was something to do with my mother or something. And I just said, I'm just really sad because this is somebody I've wanted to know about and what happened to her and so on. So I read the will and, yes, tears, as I said, and tears again, because that's really how I'd like to remember her, not sort of, being in a will and everything. And her nephew had an unusual surname, that's him there, Ray Severston. So I immediately got into the phone books, because that was still in the days when you looked up in the phone books, and also I was confident that the person would answer the phone. These days, I think if you ring someone, I don't think they're going to answer the phone. Anyway, there were 6 people in Australia with this name in the white pages. So I rang a few of them, and then I rang this number in Queensland, and I just immediately talked very, very quickly, and I said, look, I'm researching May Cox. I think she might be your aunt. And he goes, yes, how did you know? So we talked, and he was already in his 80s, and one of the first things he said was that every school holidays, because his mother was working, he used to go with his aunt May Cox and do swimming and lifesaving. She insisted that he did swimming and lifesaving. And then I got on to his wife, who was a intensive care nurse, and she came to the phone and she said, very difficult woman, extremely difficult woman. She said, I nursed her in her last few years. And that's when I found out that she'd had cancer. And of course, a person like that, well, it was just a terrible situation. And so I heard about how awful it was and how she hated being ill and so on. Didn't seem to sort of go with her personality at all. But it was just so nice to talk to them about May Cox. And Ray had been at her wedding to Mr. Lloyd, and Mr. Lloyd had died. I don't know what his name is, his first name is. But as I said earlier, she was just such an influential person. I mean, I haven't even found every newspaper article about her. I feel maybe she could even be a book. But she seemed to disappear. She went to Sydney and she just disappeared from the public record, having been in the public record as a very flamboyant personality, since 1905, as I showed you that earlier photo. So I suppose what comment at the end there is only recently I had this article written about May Cox, a person whom I don't know, her name was also Deb, rang me up from the local newspaper down near Geelong, one of the local newspapers there, and she said, "Oh, I'm reading an article that you've written about May Cox." And she said, "Did you know that the Australian Electoral Commission are thinking of changing the federal seat of Corangamite to the name Cox, after May Cox, because she had so much to do with that part of Victoria, and they wanted to recognise a woman, and she was also a philanthropist, as the Beaurepaire family were. Lily Beaurepaire and May Cox in Lorne were philanthropists. The swimming pool in Lorne was named after Lily Beaurepaire, but it's gone now. It's just called the Lorne Swimming Pool. It used to be called the Lily Beaurepaire Swimming Pool. Lily Beaurepaire, Frank Beaurepaire and May Cox used to travel around Victoria. Even when he was a mayor and a member of parliament, he was still swimming and diving, actually diving into the Yarra River, so it must have been a bit cleaner in those days, constantly fundraising for local communities so they could have a swimming pool. She was also an expert on how to build swimming pools. She'd go up there and explain to people. She also knew about how to keep the water clean. She was just everywhere. Anyway, so what happened was there was a lot of kerfuffle because the member there, Sarah Henderson, just didn't want the name to be changed, and that's what she said. She actually publicly said, "I don't want to be the member for Cox." And all sorts of other reasons, but that's what she actually, that was in an article in the Geelong Advertiser. She didn't want to be the member for Cox. And as I say there, you know, what would May have thought, we wonder. I mean, but here she still is. I mean, here she still is. She's still somebody who is in the public eye. So, so there we go. I don't really have much more to say about May Cox at the moment. I mean, I could probably talk for a long time, but I really just wanted to cover the relationship with the Public Record Office and how so many of the photos and records that helped me learn about May Cox are here. So thank you very much to the Public Record Office for allowing me to realise what a influential person she was in the Victorian community. So maybe she should be in the Victorian Honour Roll of Women. Yeah, and it's this idea of leadership as well. I mean, she never got the same pay as Frank, but she did get more money later because of the work she did in the Patriotic Committee, not for her swimming work, because of her Patriotic Committee work. Her pay did go up. There is the special case file there that explains all of that, and it went for 20 years. It's full of letters between her and the minister and so on. So, and I think there's one other, I think there's one picture there that I remember having, but it doesn't seem to be there at the moment. Was maybe is this the final one or the second final, the first one? Oh, well, anyway, I'll just talk about it really quickly. So what happened was there was also the for 5 years, as I said, she was executive officer to the Patriotic Fundraising Committee, and it was because of her work there that she ended up getting a salary increase. But it wasn't recognised, all the work that she did. So she never got what would be called equal pay, but she did get a salary increase. So she really created her 2 jobs, because no one else had ever done those sorts of jobs before. And if you read the sorts of things she did as the executive officer to the Patriotic Fundraising Committee, it was just incredible. The energy, the physical energy she must have had. And have I got a few more minutes? Oh, yeah. Because when she retired, there was this huge party in one of the top hotels in Melbourne. I don't know if I've still got the name of it in here, but it's not there anymore. But it was a very famous hotel, and she arrived in black velvet with a red satin cape. And that's just, you know, that was her personality. I mean, she was just an incredible personality and recognised in her time as very influential, but not really recognised in the education department because of the hierarchical structure. in the education department. But her life really mirrors the life of many women who worked full-time for most of their lives. But, you know, were not recognised really for what they did. So, and I think many of those women are teachers. So that's why I wanted to write about them. So, thank you.
Thought we'd do questions after each speaker. So if you've got any questions for Deb, fire away.
Thanks, Deb. Fascinating talk. My name is Margaret Bertley. Question, the publication you showed that she co-authored with Frank Beaurepaire, basically how to learn to swim and so on, I noticed that that had a reference to the Herald Learn to Swim campaign. Did your research cover the start of that campaign and how deeply was May Cox involved?
That's wonderful, because I left that out. Thank you so much. Yes, May Cox and Frank Beaurepaire did begin the Herald Learn to Swim campaign. So, yes. Oh, sorry. May Cox and Frank Beaurepaire, they started the Herald Learn to Swim campaign. It was 25 yards. I actually got my Herald certificate a long time ago, so I remember it was 25 yards. And I also got my bronze medallion for lifesaving. So, but anyway, and in Geelong I got that, but not when she was there. I'm a little bit younger than May Cox. But yeah, no, that's a very important, and the certificate actually still goes on. I don't know if it's got the same name. I don't know if anybody can tell me, but there is still a certificate for that length, which I guess is 20 metres these days. But anyway, thank you, Margaret. That was a great question. Yes, Sheila.
It's a pleasure to hear a bit more about May Cox. I'm just wondering whether in the audience I spot one or two local historians. The North Melbourne swimming pool, I believe, was set up when Frank Beaurepaire had some say in public expenditures by the City of Melbourne. And it's still a very terrific facility. And I wondered whether May Cox will have had something to do with it. People may know, or more assiduous searching of old copies of the Northern Advertiser or something of the sort. Could be a good place to have a May Cox commemoration too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Yes. Don't know your name, sorry.
Hi, my name's Robin Calder.
Hi, Robin.
I was wondering if during your research you looked into the magazines The Sportswoman that were published during the 1930s?
No, I don't know that one.
Okay.
Oh.
I'm researching the history of the Victorian Women's Cricket Association.
Oh.
And during the start of 1936 through to 1938, there were some magazines called The Sportswoman and later The Sportswoman and Physical Culturalist, which had articles on different sports that women were participating in at the time. And I can't remember seeing May's name, but it's quite possible that she did get involved in it, and they're available at the State Library of Victoria.
Oh.
And also, do you know anything about any other... Did she have any sisters?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of her having any other family. I know she was born in South Melbourne, and she obviously was a wonderful swimmer, because apparently only really good swimmers got sent to Albert Park State School, which went to year 8 in those days, and they wanted to keep their leadership position. So I'm not aware of anybody else in her family, because there's a bloke called Harvey Cox who had a sporting position in the education department, and I haven't been able to find a relationship, though Cox, I mean, in a way is a common name. But
yeah, because there was a Miss E. Cox that was involved in the early days of the Victorian Women's Cricket Association around 1928, 29.
Well, that's a similar age.
So I just sort of thought maybe they were related, because she obviously had a sporting background. So anyhow.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
More to research for me to look into, yeah.
This is not a question, just your talk brought back a lot of memories. my dad was born in 1914, and in 1919 he would have gone to the Albert Park school that you mentioned. He was a terrific swimmer, so obviously it had a great influence. He was also in the Sea Scouts, which was run at the Albert Park Lake.
Oh.
And as children, we migrated down to the Bomb Beach area, and I did my 50 metres certificate. And it didn't matter what the weather was like, the time of the year, we were marched to the beach and told to swim.
I know.
So
The waves going like this,
Yes,
and
exactly.
mouthfuls of water.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember.
yeah. But my dad was a great swimmer and loved the beach all his life. So I've got photos of him at that school, and it's very interesting to sort of piece that together with what you're talking about. So thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody here lives near Surrey Hills or knows that area with the Surrey Dive. It used to be May Cox used to teach swimming there, and apparently it was freezing cold. It was an old mine or something, but quarry, yeah. But she used to teach everywhere, in rivers, everywhere, everywhere. And it was free for students. It was free.
Went into it and ended up at the bottom of it.
Oh,
But it was clay. It was like a brickwork, so it's clay. So you could imagine the bottom would be just silted mud. So if anything went in, but it's meant to be bottomless. Now they use it for model boats. So they have championships on there. You can't swim in it anymore.
Vision and realisation, you came across any other women, even maybe a bit later, that you thought should be recognised? Because I taught the education department, and my first appointment was the music staff, and there was a woman called Doris Irwin, who I'm sure everyone remembers, who was quite similar, I'd say, to May.
yeah.
So did you come across any
Don't remember that. Well, I remember the name, but I don't remember it being in the book.
Okay.
That's one of the things that that's why May Cox is so interesting, because she's in there. It's her personality. There probably were other positions. There was a cookery teacher and various others, but I just think it was her personality and her drive that got this recognition. So even, when it was written in 1973, Vision and Realisation, and she died back then and hadn't been heard of since 1938, she still starred in everyone remembered her. But no, I mean, it's wrong that there's very few women in Vision and Realisation. You've probably seen all the photos in the back, about 150 photos in the back, and I think there's 3 women. Yeah.
That was fantastic, and the questions are really interesting too. So thanks again, Deb. May well understood the value of her own work, and she stated her own significance. And it's interesting because we still don't do that as women. I've attended a session at Melbourne Uni aimed at women going for promotion, and the strong message is, you've got to tell us why what you're doing is good. Don't apologise for not having done something. Tell us why what you're doing is good, and that's something that we still find hard to do. So good on May. And I also think, given that we did mention Madge Connor getting posthumously onto the Victorian Honour Roll of Women, absolutely, I think we're going to have to work together to try and get May Cox onto it. She should be there. So we'll move on to Liz Rushen, Dr. Liz Rushen, and I'm going to introduce Liz, remembering that we have a wide audience out there who are going to see this and may not know our speakers. So Dr. Liz Rushen is the chair of the History Council of Victoria. She was a State Library of Victoria Creative Fellow. It was or still is. She is a State Library of Victoria Creative Fellow for this 2018-19 period. What a wonderful thing. And an Adjunct Research Associate in the School of Historical Studies at Monash Uni. Liz is a former Executive Director of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria and has published widely in the field of migration history, including her books Single and Free, Female Migration to Australia, and A Social History, Bishop's Court, Melbourne, Official Residence and Family Home. Let's welcome Liz.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you everyone for the warm welcome. International Women's Day was first celebrated 108 years ago, and the date on which it was celebrated was the 19th of March, 1911. So we're not so late after all in celebrating International Women's Day. But there are so many functions on the 8th of March, which is when we usually recognise International Women's Day, that it makes sense to have it as International Women's Month. And since those early days, International Women's Day has been a central point for action to build support for women's rights and their full participation in the economy, politics, community, and in everyday life. But I'm going to talk today on a period that goes back even further than Deb's early 20th century and have a look at the mid-19th century, in the early days of the Port Phillip district, when women were denied full participation in everyday life and they were denied a public voice. That is, the white women of the settlement. We know so little about the Aboriginal women, and their records are really hard to extract from the archives, as are really the women, the records of the white women in that period. But I thought we'd have a look today at what the archives do tell us and the other sources reveal about the lives of the pioneering women. One of the go-to sources for information on the first years of white settlement is the Chronicles of Early Melbourne, written by Irishman Edmund Finn, who wrote under the pseudonym Gary Owen. I'm currently undertaking an analysis of the Chronicles as part of a broader study of Finn, and I've looked at his subjects asking the question, does Finn's writing reflect the gender balance in colonial Melbourne? So here we have a breakdown of the population in the years Finn wrote about, based on census returns, showing that the proportion of women grew from just under 20% in 1836 to 40% in 1851, an average of 27.75% in the total population in those years. In comparison, of the just under 3,000 people mentioned in the Chronicles, a mere 216 were women. That is 10.83% of the total. So already we see a bias in Finn's understanding of the world, typical of the male of the period, and further analysis reveals some interesting insights. Of the 216 women named by Finn, half are noted together with their husbands, fathers, brothers, that is, in the context of male family members. Of the remaining 106 women who are mentioned in their own right, 43 were actresses. This statistic reveals a lot about the man Finn and his interests in the theatre. Not only are 43 actresses mentioned, but Finn notes 100 male actors, and the number of theatre programs and invitations contained in his scrapbooks in the State Library confirm his strong interest in the theatre. Of the remaining 63 women Finn considers noteworthy, 22 were mentioned for health incidents, usually bizarre, such as the 3 women who gave birth to triplets, or those who are early Melbourne hospital patients, or those who were burned in a bushfire or poisoned or committed suicide. 14 attended the fancy dress ball for separation. 19 were before the courts, whether for keeping a disorderly house, on trial for murder, or witness to a robbery, or the 3 who are mentioned in breach of promise cases. Some were witnesses to crimes. 2 women were noted for merely arriving. And 1 was a 17-year-old who married a 65-year-old man. Finn was always interested in the salacious. In contrast, apart from the actresses, only 12 women were mentioned in the light of their occupations. 4 ran schools, 2 were squatters, they are the Mrs Drysdale and Newcombe, of course, 2 were boarding house keepers, 1 was a matron, there was a confectioner, a tobacconist, and 1 was the first female mason in the colony. 5 women were mentioned by Finn for their philanthropy. 1 woman was noted as surviving 9 days lost in the bush with 2 children. 2 women were associated with the White Woman of Gippsland saga, a saga which still puzzles, and several people, including myself, have written about that incident. And finally, Finn wrote about 1 woman who had the best mare in the Victorian Industrial Society exhibition. Finn referred to another woman who wanted to speak in favour of the establishment of a Lutheran church, but was prevented from speaking at a meeting, indicating that Finn had some sense of the lack of empowerment of women at the time. Finn's references to the women who ran schools are all very brief. For example, he refers to an advertisement in the Port Phillip Gazette that vacation at Mrs Cook's school would end on the 1st of January 1839, as the first mention of a school in Melbourne. Although she was also Irish-born, Finn makes no reference to Nicola Cook's fascinating life story, her determination to be independent and maintain agency in frontier Melbourne. I put together Nicola's story piece by piece, using many of the resources here at Prov, and the details were published in 2009 edition of Prov's online journal Provenance. Nicola's story came to light again at the end of last year during the Metro Tunnel dig behind Young and Jackson's Hotel, when traces of her school were excavated. It's worth noting that several significant women are missing from the chronicles. Finn refers to Edward, Francis, James and Stephen Henty, but not to Jane, Anne Maria or Eliza. Another significant omission is Georgiana McRae, although her husband has quite a few references, but is less highly regarded today. In this omission, we can see that Finn was a man of his times, and his writing reflects the contemporary gender bias and lack of awareness of the contributions of women to a civil society. This analysis of Finn's perception of women needs to be balanced against his actions, however. He was concerned about reports in the Argus about Irish orphan girls, and he studied police reports to verify the facts. Finn concluded that the girls from Irish workhouses came under notice for crime and immorality less often than other immigrant women. He called on his fellow Irishmen to defend the women's, to reject attacks on the orphans and on the general contribution of the life of the Irish in colonial Victoria. So who are the women Finn neglected to mention in the chronicles? They are the women who led lives of quiet domesticity, whose lives didn't reach the public arena, typical of the majority of women at the time. Much of my work as an historian has been into the lives of approximately 3,000 women who came to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land in the 1830s, many of whom made their way to the Port Phillip district. The second of these ships was the Princess Royal, which sailed from England to Hobart, containing an admixture of classes, as Lieutenant Colonel Arthur reprovingly described the women. I write about the Princess Royal women in my book Fair Game, and today I thought I'd share with you some of their stories. Elizabeth Fry, more famously known as the Angel of the Prisons for her work with women in Newgate Prison, had established the Chelsea School of Reform after being appalled to find young girls incarcerated in Newgate with their mothers. She nominated 2 girls from the school to join the women on the Princess Royal. They were 15-year-old Hannah Substead, who married 6 years after her arrival at Hobart, and she moved to New South Wales, and Catherine Hand, who emigrated aged 16, married 6 years after arrival, and raised a family of 8 children, both women fulfilling the contemporary view that these women become wives and mothers in the colonies. By contrast, immigrant Elizabeth Taylor had the longest list of occupations. She could, quote, work, bake, brew, wait at table, wash and iron. Her list of skills would imply that she was ideally suited for employment in the colony and that she would prosper with a high annual wage. However, shortly after her arrival in September 1832, the Ladies' Committee reported that she was engaged in a gentleman's family and turned away in 3 weeks for drunkenness. The circumstances surrounding this event are not given, and it's an indictment on colonial society that male immigrants were judged for their skills, whereas women were judged by a perception of their respectability. There was no consideration of their feelings of isolation or helplessness during their translocation, no support in the form of an immigrant's home to which they could turn if their employment didn't turn out, or if their employer was abusive. Of the 200 women on board the Princess Royal, 22 are known to have moved to Victoria, and at least 20% were from dissenting backgrounds, that is, according to shipping information and the women's colonial marriage and the birth registrations of their children. 12 had Baptist connections, 6 were Methodist, and another 4 were Wesleyans. 7 were Presbyterian, 2 were married according to the rites of the Congregational Church, while 8 have been located with independent connections. On this English ship, only 2 women have been identified as Catholic. The large number of women with known dissenting associations indicates that, at a time when adherents to dissenting churches were unable to hold public office or attend university, these were independent-thinking women who sought more opportunities than provided at home. The life stories of 3 of the women with dissenting backgrounds and who moved to Victoria were typical of that of 19-year-old Harriet Emblem from Stratford, Essex, whose father was a Baptist minister. 4 years after her arrival, she married Alfred Wheatley, the son of William Wheatley, librarian to His Majesty's Navy. Alfred had arrived in Van Diemen's Land as a sailor a month before the Princess Royal arrived. His 3 sisters migrated to Hobart on the Strathfieldsaye in 1834 as bounty women, and that was the same year that Alfred and Harriet held the first meeting of the Bothwell Literary Society at their home. Alfred was appointed Chief Constable in 1835 and Inspector of Stock the next year. Following the birth of their son, in 1840 they moved to Victoria, where their next 7 children were born. Harriet died, aged 69, at St Kilda in August 1885. On the other hand, Mary Jane Fay, aged 19, migrated as matron to a group of 41 girls and women from the London Female Penitentiary at Pentonville. On arrival, the ladies of the reception committee noted that she was a very respectable person engaged by a gentleman as governess to his brother's children in Hobart Town. 5 months after her arrival, together with fellow Princess Royal immigrant Harriet Mitchell, Mary Jane was received into the Independent Church at Hobart. Mary Jane and Harriet were conducting a seminary for young ladies in Brisbane Street and married on the same day in June 1834, each witnessing the other's marriage. Mary Jane had caused a sensation when she refused to swear the oath of allegiance when witness in a court case the previous October. And she married William Warham and continued to live in the school with some of the students, while Harriet taught the day pupils. Life became difficult for Mary Jane when her husband died of a heart attack in 1845, aged 38, leaving her with 5 young children. She didn't remarry and eventually moved to Victoria to join her 3 married daughters, dying at Mount Coorong near Wedderburn in 1891. Life treated Harriet Mitchell more kindly. Together with her husband, Francis Edgar, they became foundation members of Hobart Baptist Church, holding meetings in their home until a chapel was erected. In November 1847, they purchased Stanwell Hall, a 2-storey stone house which still stands on the corner of Barrack and Melville Streets. John Glover, the artist, lived here at one time and painted the house and garden. Following the births of 2 children and the death of one, in 1848, Harriet and Francis moved to Victoria, accompanied by Harriet's mother, who joined them in Launceston. Frances had been appointed superintendent of the Aboriginal school at the junction of the Yarra and Merry Creeks. They lived there 3 years, an experience later described by their daughter Lucy in her book, Among the Black Boys, being the history of an attempt at civilising some young Aboriginals of Australia, very typical language of the 1860s. In 1851, the family returned to Stanwell Hall, where Harriet died 20 years later. Lucy's book gives a rare insight into life at the site near Dights Falls, including their garden of vegetables, native shrubs and fruit trees, including nectarines, watermelon and grapes. Much of Lucy's information is referred to in Ian Clark and Toby Hayden's pivotal report, A Bend in the Yarra, A History of the Merry Creek Protectorate Station and Merry Creek Aboriginal School, 1841 to 51, based mainly on their detailed examination of the correspondence in VPRS 11, Unit 10, which includes correspondence from Francis Edgar, Lucy's father, to the committee of the Aboriginal Mission. While Lucy's book mainly focuses on the domestic, it does confirm the contemporary view that the first teacher, Peacock, used proselyting as his main method of education. The detailed examination of the archival record undertaken by Clark and Hayden demonstrates how much broader understanding of a person's life or circumstances can be obtained only by a thorough examination of the archival record. Large numbers of enterprising and educated single women saw the possibilities of enhanced lifestyle through emigration. Kinship networks were clearly critical to the manner in which they coped with their translocation. Their survival was also due to their own abilities and attitudes. Many women maintained their shipboard networks and supported each other throughout their lives. Their stories reveal the full range of life experiences. Some lived long lives, others died soon after arrival through accident or suicide, unable to cope with the translocation at a time when few supports were offered. And here's just a sample of a few more women's stories, mainly obtained by delving into the archives. Louisa Arpin is believed to be the longest living Princess Royal woman. She was aged 18 when she migrated from a workhouse. No marriage registration has been found for Louisa's relationship with Philip Humphreys, a brickmaker, who worked for John Pascoe Faulkner. On the 14th of September 1837, the couple moved across Bass Strait on Faulkner's ship, the Enterprise. In March 38, the population of Melbourne was estimated at 600 people. William Humphreys listed as the head of a household of 3 males and 3 females. They raised their family of 11 children and watched Melbourne become marvellous. When Louisa died in June 1912, she had 7 children living, 45 grandchildren, and many great-grandchildren. One of several women who made their homes in Victoria's Western District was Mary Ann Gurr, whose story depicts the difficulties of frontier life for pioneering women. Mary Ann was devastated by having a child lost in the bush. She migrated from Tenterden in Kent to Launceston with her parents and siblings when she was 16. 3 years later, she was permitted to marry a convict, but chose instead to marry Robert Hazelwood, a blacksmith, at Launceston Wesleyan Chapel. In 1843, together with their then 4 children, they moved to Portland. 10 years later, while Mary Ann and the children were in the bush collecting beetles, they discovered that the toddler, Freddie, was missing. Mary Ann, heavily pregnant, was distraught. 2 months later, still inconsolable at the loss of Freddie, she died following the birth of Jabez, her 11th child. Another particularly tragic death was that of Fanny Dawson. She migrated as a bounty immigrant from Lincolnshire, again with her parents and siblings, when she was aged 12. In 1847, she married Joseph Longmore, and 13 years later, when living in Ballarat, all but one of her family of 9 died. Joseph's death was caused by a complaint, and in the last months of his illness, 7 of their children succumbed to a diphtheria epidemic. Heartbroken, Fanny died, aged 36, the day before Joseph. The only surviving child, the eldest, 12-year-old Alfred, returned to his relatives in Sydney, eventually opening a chemist shop and later a factory manufacturing many household goods, trading as Francis Longmore & Co., makers of White Crow products. And does anybody buy White Crow sauce? That's the family. Not all the immigrant women remained entirely subsumed within the confines of family life. Some who married successful men proved themselves to be equally enterprising, adding to their established holdings after their husbands' deaths. Yet other women were able to maintain an independent lifestyle and support themselves by teaching or by operating businesses, whether married or single. And I'll share with you one last story, that of Jane McCarthy, who migrated as a 20-year-old daughter of a farmer in County Limerick, Ireland. 2 years after her arrival at Sydney, she married a convict, Isaac Ray. Isaac was approaching the time to gain his ticket of leave, so marriage to Jane, a free immigrant, was of benefit to him. But it was clearly a marriage of affection, Isaac later declaring to his sister that he had been married for, quote, over 22 years to one of the best women in the world. Isaac was literate, enterprising, and 7 years older than Jane, a protector and competent worker. The couple moved to the management of hotels, a way of life whose success depended on an active partnership between husband and wife. Their marriage was very successful, producing 10 children and establishing a trio of hotels in country Victoria after a foray to San Francisco in 1852. As hotel owners during the gold rush, the family became very comfortable, and despite her illiteracy, Jane ran the Denali Hotel for many years after Isaac's death. It's very difficult to trace the life of pioneering women, but despite these difficulties, what remains is a clear picture of enterprising women, women who embrace the opportunity to create a new future for themselves in the frontier life of the colonies. The women were not the sweepings of the workhouses, as they have so oftenly been portrayed. They are adventurous and courageous women who embrace the challenges of colonial life. For the vast majority who had made the voluntary decision to migrate, their expatriation had improved the quality of their lives and placed them in a position of comfort and security denied to their sisters who remained in Great Britain and Ireland. The inability of some colonists to accept these women, particularly the Catholic, Gaelic-speaking Irish women, is mirrored in Australia's society today by sections of our community who are unwilling to accept newer arrivals, particularly if they worship under different faiths. These issues of religion and language resonate with us in considering immigrants who wish to make Australia their home today. These women I talk about freely chose to come here, seeking new life opportunities, but like the immigrants of today, they were little understood. Communities are naturally wary of large numbers of people they consider are impinging on their territory. How we accept newcomers is a measure of our compassion and our maturity as a society. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So, throw the floor open to questions.
Liz, I know it's difficult with records relating to law and order, but did you get any sort of sense of domestic violence?
Not domestic violence, that I don't think was really reported in those days, but I have come across a lot of court records of abuse by employers, and some of these women were quite prepared to go to court and stand up for their rights. And there was one woman who took her employers to court because under the employment conditions, she was meant to be fed she had her board paid and her lodging paid, and she was meant to be fed the same food as the family. She was fed scraps. She said, this isn't reasonable. She took her employer to court. She didn't win, but she brought the situation to the notice of the police. One part of my research has been to look into the attitude, particularly towards the Irish women. And so I looked at the numbers of Irish women who were before the courts. And now the Irish women were before the courts many, many more times than the English or Scottish women. And so I analysed the cases, and most of the cases were withdrawn or the women weren't charged. So it's showing clear prejudice against them without solid evidence of wrongdoing, as it would have been called. Yeah. At the back.
Thanks for that. It certainly inspires me to do more research into my own great-grandmother, who was a Protestant woman who married a Catholic boy and ended up with 13 children. And she was postmistress and station mistress, where he was a ganger on the railways, and they travelled right throughout Victoria. So another working woman. But I also have a family story that my great-grandfather, when he was 8, went for a walk with one of his brothers, and the little sister, who was 5, went to follow. And she disappeared in the bush, never to be seen again. And apparently on his deathbed, even though he was only 8, his last words were, "my little sister," and he carried that guilt. So it was a very common story.
Yes, it's a really heartbreaking story. So many children were lost in the bush, and they didn't have the resources then to find them. Your comment about your great-grandmother who was employed while her husband was employed in the post office while her husband was a ganger is quite a common story. The number of women whose work outside the family home was unrecognised, and their work inside the family home was even less recognised, at a time when men often travelled to work, or men ran carting businesses. Who was running the business from home while they were away? You know, very little recognition has been given to the women and their contributions to the economy.
Quite rare. I was told being a station mistress would have been quite prestigious, so I'll have to research that.
Definitely worth researching, definitely. Yeah.
Hello. I'm researching a great-grandmother who came out as an Irish Catholic assisted migrant in 1857, and from what you heard, I'm very proud of the fact that she took her employer to court for unpaid wages, but tracking her through Victoria up until that period when she was married in 1860 is quite difficult. This is probably not very fair to just spring on you, but I found it. She took out miners' rights when they moved onto the goldfields. And I was interested, didn't seem terribly easy to find out when women had property rights. Was it the same as in England? Which I haven't got the date, I'm hopeless with dates, but women were not allowed to buy property in their own name.
Married women, you're
married
talking
women,
about. Single women could.
Single women
were able to.
Ah, right, because it was because a woman's property was totally that of a husband, only the husband could buy it. All right, so if she's a widow, yes, and you don't know about minors' rights?
I know a little about minors' rights, but
yeah.
my general comment would
Yes.
be to you, you are so fortunate that A, she took her employers to court, and B, she did apply for minors' rights, because both those, and owned land, so all three incidents
Yes.
mean she is in the public record, and it's
Yes.
a matter of delving through, and some people here might be able to help you work out which records are the appropriate ones.
Yes.
But so few of the women in those times did any of those things, wrote a will. They've often totally absent from the public record.
Yes.
So you're in a very fortunate position, and it's just going to take a bit of delving,
Yes.
and you'll find your answers definitely.
Well, Claudia Wright's book on the Forgotten Rebels of Eureka is also quite encouraging too. So things like the numbers of recorded publicans, there were obviously a lot more than these male chroniclers recorded. But if anyone here is interested in doing anything on assisted migration, I'd be happy to talk to them. And this is a later period than yours, late 1850s. Thank you.
My ancestor was an Irish famine orphan, and we believe her family had perished in the famine. She came out to Victoria and fell pregnant to the son of the owner of the property she was working at. I'm descended from that child. She went on to become an alcoholic, prostitute, in and out of prisons, which is a bonus in a way that she's left a record behind. But she was very much hidden in the family in the past, whereas now we're able to look at her story with a lot more sadness and just the changing of perspectives.
Yes, and understanding too that these women had no supports. So what happened if they were abused by their employer or their employer's son? And it happens so often. Some women, I know, gave their children the middle name of the father, so that there would at least be some recognition that that child belonged to that family. But it was extremely difficult, and there were so few options for women, for single women, and then it was, of course, complicated even further once they had a child.
I was just interested in the bounty women that came through. One of my ancestors is in your book. So
I beg your pardon, I missed that last bit.
One of my ancestors is in your book, so I'd love to get a copy of that someday.
Oh, we'll have to have a talk.
But what I wanted to know was, is there any listings of where all the bounty women ended up? Like, from what I've been able to find is they got off the ship and then they either got married, or I haven't been able to find more
The women
information.
who, in fact, it's it's the case with all bounty immigrants. By the word bounty, the word bounty changed over time. Initially, it was a bounty towards the cost of their passage, but all immigrants who came as assisted immigrants had to work for some time, virtually to pay back the cost of their passage. The immigrant women from the 1830s had to find their employment when they arrived, and the process was a hiring day, if you like. The women were quite familiar with that sort of process, and those of you who have read Thomas Hardy's Mayor of Casterbridge, he describes a hiring day, and people would hire out their labour for a day, a week, a month, a season. So it was a very similar sort of situation here. But it also meant, if you think of those women, they just spent 4 months on a ship coming here. Seasons were different, everything was different, and they were expected to be employed within 3 days. They were given 3 days accommodation and food, and after that they were on their own. So to try and make a reasoned decision in the hustle and bustle of a crowded hall or whatever the facility was extremely difficult, and so you can understand that a lot of the employment arrangements fell down. Even male family bounty immigrants who arrived from about 1836 onwards, often their employment was organised before they arrived in the colonies. So they at least had some knowledge of where they would be going while they were making their voyage here. Slightly easier, I would think, than someone who is thinking, what on earth is life going to be like? Where am I going to be living? And there are some examples of the Colonial Secretary, Alexander McLean, Sydney, wrote up a list of bee women on one ship. It was quite a long list, some of them reputed to be on the town, that sort of thing. There was one woman who, against her name, had said, left her place of employment without permission. Now, she arrived in Sydney with her sister. Her sister was employed in Macquarie Place in the centre of Sydney. This girl was employed at Lake Macquarie with the Innes family. And you can understand in the hustle and bustle of the hiring experience, they would have both heard Macquarie and thought that they were going to be close to each other, not hundreds of kilometres separated from each other. There was another girl, against her name was the notation, her mistress is jealous of her. Who was the one who should be on the P list? Is it the girl who was, there are all sorts of things that you can interpret out of such lists, and a bit of research, and you can find a more accurate understanding of what actually happened. At the back.
My name's Marilyn Kenny. Can I just say things weren't all that much better nearly 100 years later? I've researched Georgiana Bingham, who was the first lady immigration officer ever employed by the Victorian government. This is about 1911, when assisted passengers from Britain were reintroduced. And she started volunteering, meeting the ships, because all these single women were coming out without any arrangements, and in the end got herself appointed against opposition because she was married, so she didn't need the salary of £100 a year, of course. That parliamentary questions were asked. And she did this, met every ship, interviewed every single woman, placed them, and had hiring days, very similar. So, as I say, nearly 80 years later, things hadn't changed all that much.
No. And of course, Carolyn Chisholm established the first immigrants' home in 1841, and I look at the women from the 1830s. That was the first immigrants' home. And she also, it was Strutt, took people out, the surgeon or superintendent on board the ship. Sometimes the women were looked after by kindly people, but often they were just left to their own resources. Yeah, and it's distressing to hear that it's, 60, 70, 80 years later, the story's still the same.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you, Deb. They were both great talks, thank you, and I think probably we've got a lot of people who are interested in the history of the women in their own families, and I would really encourage you to get stuck into Trove, get stuck into Prov, and use those sources together, because you will. It's hard to find them, but you can, particularly if they've been criminal. I know, because my great-great-grandmother, I found descriptions of her in the paper as a virago and a reprobate. Yes. And newspapers have been very helpful, as have Prov records. Something I forgot to do at the beginning was I wanted to ask, do we have any volunteers here, people who do volunteer work at Prov? Fantastic, because I wanted to say how much I value, and I know that other historians and researchers value your work, because without it, I know that we wouldn't be able to get right into what we are able to sometimes. So I'd like to thank you. Thank you for coming today, but thank you for your work, so thank you. And I know we said 1 till 3, but we have finished, unless there's any more general questions that people would like to ask, or any more comments from our distinguished speakers. There is one.
Assisted immigration programs. I read one reference that said that when land was opened up for selectors in 1865, that paid for assisted migration, which was about filling in the labour problems of the gold rush. Is this true?
It's a story that goes back a bit earlier than that. In 1831, the first immigration commission was established in England, and they had to work out a way to encourage immigration. And they also had to, two of their major challenges, the first one was finding the money to support immigration, and the second one was how to encourage women to migrate. So to solve the first problem of the financing the immigration, they used the concept developed by Ripon. The Ripon regulations is what they're called, whereby the sale of the free gifts of land in the colonies to squatters and people who came would no longer be allowed. People had to purchase their land. And the government used the money raised from the sale of land to fund immigration. And they did that right through the 19th century. That's where the majority of the money came from. And to encourage women to come, they sent out those first two ships I talked about, the Red Rover, which was full of Irish women, to Sydney, and the Princess Royal, which was mainly full of English women from London to Hobart. And I write about the Immigration Commission in my book, Fair Game.
Where is your book available, Liz? And Dev's book as well. We have a number of distinguished authors here.
My books are available through my publisher, Anchor Books Australia, or you can go to my website, which is the 3 W's and then my surname, which is Rushen, rushen.com.au.
Great. Thank you very much. And look, we do have a question at the back from Sheila.
Just a kind of general comment. Thank you, Sheila Bayard. A number in the room I can hear are maybe starting out, but some of us are here because we're well aware of the Australian Women's Register and making the unknown women known in different ways. What about this Inside Story mob who are doing some joint project with the National Dictionary of Biography? He keeps sending me invitations to give them some money to get names up of women from New South Wales. Are they the competition, or are we working with the National Dictionary of Biography as well, but just only on the Victorian
How
women?
embarrassing. I haven't heard of them. Who are they?
No idea. They just did a series of 4 posts for International Women's Day week month. Of course, there was some talk we were going to be doing Women's History Month. They are in North America, I think, this month.
Well,
Thank you.
It's a broad church in women's history, and generally we like to collaborate with each other. I mean, without each other, we're nothing. I've benefited from the research of many people in this room.
I'll retweet the tweet I received about it. But in fact, it's part of the project that's out of ANU to really address the imbalance in the Australian Dictionary of Biography throughout Australia. It isn't really Sydney.
Yes, so that I do know about. So you've thrown me with the inside story, but we wholeheartedly support their endeavours at the National Dictionary of Biography. So yes, we do. But go to our website and subscribe to our newsletter. As I say, it's only 4 times a year, and you'll find out about things like this and research that we've been doing. So thank you again, everybody, for coming, and hope to see you next year.